Welcome back to the Dairy Raid. And one of the few bright spots in a down 2025 season is that we're finally able to say that the defense took a step forward. And the vision that Luke Fickell and Mike Tressel have had for the unit finally started to become more clear. It took 2 years of attempted merging of the elite to bring the coaching staff to the realization that mismatches in hardware and software couldn't simply be fixed by coaching players up, being tougher, playing Wisconsin football, etc. Sometimes it was just as simple as square pegs do not fit in round holes. So, what did they do? Well, on top of the renewed emphasis of adding size and strength in the offseason conditioning program, the coaching staff went shopping and brought in a ton of players to completely rebuild the defense, especially the defensive line and the edges. And when you complement that with improved inside linebacker play, especially when Mason Poston and Cooper Catalano became full-time starters, you saw rapid improvement. And the play of the players in the box was not just caused by bringing in more players and bringing in more talent. But I think the coaching staff did a much better job at taking the raw player, finding what they were good at, and then building a role that maximized their talent. And that's what I want to talk about today is the roles that were created in the 2025 season. Are they going to be duplicated in 2026? Are they going to evolve? Are we going to get new roles in the 2026 season? That's what I want to take a look at. And to keep things simple and not to bog things down in the minutia of football terminology, I'm actually going to take kind of a cue from the fan base. And a lot of these roles are defined by the person who occupied them. So when I say the Mason Reiger role, in your head, you can already start picturing, well, what did Mason Reiger do? And then what type of player can fill that spot? So let's just start right there. Mason Reiger. I said it many times throughout the season, and I'll stand by it. I think Mason Reiger is one of the most fundamentally sound outside linebackers we have had at Wisconsin in a long time. He is an every down outside linebacker. They could have him put his hand in the dirt, rush the passer. They could move him inside to stop the run. He had the ability to be under control in many situations where other outside linebackers offenses would use their aggressiveness to their disadvantage. And so when we think about someone filling the Mason Reiger role, we need to find a player who we don't want to leave the field. The best all-around player. And that an offense can't take advantage of because they are below average in certain particular areas. Next up, the Daryl Peterson role. This is the one that I've been hearing about the most. It's almost its own position, and that is the Daryl Peterson role. So what is the Daryl Peterson role? Well, Daryl Peterson was the opposite side of the coin from Mason Reiger. I think Daryl was a gifted player. He's aggressive. He played bigger than his 6'1" frame would lead you to believe. He had the ability to put his hand in the dirt and act as a defensive lineman, a defensive tackle at times. And throughout the season, I think he got better everything maybe except pass rush. He still would bug the hell out of me with his spin moves, getting himself out of position because he was just so hell bent on getting into the backfield. The Daryl Peterson role, though, is going to be your field side run down space occupier who, when allowed to, can rush the passer. He played in combination with Sebastian Cheeks. They both had different player profiles. They were both used at the same position, but they were both used differently. So in the Daryl Peterson role, you're going to need a pseudo defensive lineman who can play gap to gap. You can line him up in the C gap. He can squeeze. You can line him up in the B gap. He can take on a double team. He is going to be a pseudo defensive end who hopefully has enough pass rush ability that in situations where we get a second and long or a third and short, situations where it may be a run down, if we get caught in a play action, get caught in an RPA or something like that, he can get after the quarterback. That's the Daryl Peterson role. So the Sebastian Cheeks role is you take the outside, the Mason Reiger role, you subtract what Daryl Peterson does, and that's Sebastian Cheeks. Sebastian Cheeks was your field side outside linebacker who would get after the quarterback. They didn't really have him put his hand in the dirt. He would be aggressive, but they would also drop him into coverage. He was a great guy to bait protection with, especially when they would pair him with Daryl Peterson. Sometimes would come in and play the boundary outside linebacker. They would use him to bait protection to set up pass rush coming from a different direction. So a guy who is comfortable playing up on the line, who has some pass rush ability, but is athletic enough that he can drop into coverage if necessary and when necessary. All right, so next up, this role didn't happen as much because he was injured for part of the season, and that's Corey Walker. Corey Walker was one of these oversized edge players who 15 years ago would have been just a stereotypical field side defensive end in a 4-3 defense. And that's essentially what he was. There was times where he got exploited for that fact, where he would line up on an edge, whether it didn't matter what side, and he didn't get the support behind him that he needed, and he was taken advantage of in the zone read game, especially the Illinois game. But a big body who is going to set the edge based on size and is going to set a pivot point for everyone behind him. That's what we need in that type of role, a bigger body who is going to allow the inside linebacker behind him to flow over the top, and is going to allow the nickel / star to push the edge deeper. Speaking of the star nickel spot, let's talk about the star outside linebacker. And this is about the only one that doesn't have a particular person that I think of, because they used 3 different people or 4 different people and to do the same job, but they all had kind of different player types. So whether it be Aaron Witt, who's more of a bigger body that they kind of used as like a Sam linebacker in a 4-3 defense and more of a run-heavy type guy. You would sometimes get Thomas Heiberger, who is quicker, more of a sideline-to-sideline type guy who maybe makes you feel, it's more like more of a pro style current Sam outside linebacker who is that kind of hybrid type player. Tack Curtis had been out there at some point. Christian Allegro, they had talked about moving him there this year. So a star linebacker needs to be he has to have the ability to play from the edge to the sideline on the field side. And that takes a special kind of athlete, unless you're just going to make him play downhill and have him play like not a wide nine, like a wide 14, a really wide edge setter, which you could have. But I think with the direction this defense is going, with the type of bodies that they are bringing in, they're going to use that linebacker as more than just an edge setter. He's going to have to be a guy who plays in space and is able to be a pivot point for everybody around him. And I think the star linebacker is going to have a much more expanded role coming into 2026 for the simple fact that I don't think they really went out and got a true nickel as they had the previous years in the portal. So that nickel spot is also going to be kind of by committee. All right. So those are the outside linebacker positions. I mean, you see right there, we went through 5 different outside linebacker positions. Now let's talk about the interior defensive line, the defensive tackles, and what those roles are, and start thinking about who could fill those type of roles. So first and foremost, let's talk about Javier Suggs. He's a player who came in and had an immediate impact on the defense. He was your 3 tech field side rusher. He brought a nice interior pass rush ability to the defense. But again, what he really did a good job with was just creating chaos in the interior. And a guy like him is why players like Mason Posa and Cooper Catalano, Mason Posa in particular, had so much success because a player like Javier Suggs would occupy multiple blockers and allow the linebacker behind him to play sideline to sideline. That's huge. And then when you get in situations where he was single blocked, well, then he had the ability to break blocks and get into pass rush or get into the run fit. A really overall solid 3 tech type player. On the other side of the coin, we had the interior nose tackle spot, and that was manned mostly by Ben Barton, by Parker Peterson. This is your space holder, block absorber, boundary side defensive tackle. Their job is to stay close to the line of scrimmage, to maintain that gap, and again, to allow the linebackers behind them to flow. I think, Ben Barton has been getting a lot of praise. I think he had some work he had to do last season, but when he was on and could get low, he could hold that A gap better than anybody. And Parker Peterson, I think, also did a pretty solid job. I think he was also dinged up as well. But you need that big squat, that 300 plus pounder that can just sit between the center and the guard, occupy blocks, and keep that A gap closed. So again, a guy like Cooper Catalano can just flow over the top because he knows not only is the cutback going to be filled, but the gap in the line of scrimmage is going to be there to bump the ball outside. In that same position, but a different uh, player type, was Brandon Lane. He was a big plus for the defense, and I was really happy to see him improve. It's a similar body type to Ben Barton and Parker Peterson, but he brought that interior rush that you can get underneath and just drive those blocks back into the quarterback. And he's a guy who would help a guy like Mason Reiger because you couldn't double team Reiger if you had a Brandon Lane inside. He's a really complementary defensive tackle to the outside linebackers in pass rush situations because he had enough quickness that he could get under a block and drive a guy backwards. But again, just to occupy blockers and to do it with a different style. Ben Barton and Parker Peterson were just size and strength. Brandon Lane had it with quickness for a 300 pounder, with the first step that he could then bring power and getting underneath these blockers. So it's another role in the defensive line that is definitely going to need to be filled. All right, so we've got all these different roles. Who is going to be the guy to fill a lot of these spots? Well, let's start where we ended here, and then we'll work our way back up to the top because I think the Mason Rider role obviously is the one that everyone's going to want to hear about what we're going to do. So let's start with the Brandon Lane role. Do we have a player in that 6'1", 6 foot, 300 something pound range who can play to the boundary, has quickness, can get off the ball and penetrate, and could work down the line of scrimmage and squeeze, say it, a wide zone to the field? Well, if you look at the body types and the players we have on the roster right now, the first guy I would think about in that type of situation would be Charles Perkins. He's a guy that I wish that could have gotten more reps last year. I think he was injured. There may have been some other issues as well, but a guy that can we need a guy who can set that interior edge at the A gap and then squeeze and press down the line of scrimmage. So I think that a guy like Charles Perkins would be the first one up in a role like that. When we look at the Ben Barton, Parker Peterson run fit nose tackle type guy, that's where it gets to be a little bit trickier. And I think we're going to have to rely on younger guys and transfers to fill a spot like that. So we're thinking like a guy like, Hammond Russell, or maybe a Dylan Johnson. Dylan Johnson is, again, I've been saying this, he looks smaller. I think it's just because of how he is built. He's maybe built more with, he's built differently. He doesn't look like he's a 300 pounder, but he is. A guy who can play with leverage and take on blockers. That's what we need in that spot. Han Russell is a big 6'3", over 300 pounds, big, long, not to say a long body, but is low to the ground. And when you get someone like Dylan Johnson, the wrestler, used to be playing with leverage, I think that would be a pretty good spot with him. The Javier Suggs role, that's going to be interesting because you could throw Junior Poyser as a disruptor type there. He could also be in the Brandon Lane role as because he's a little bit shorter, put him on the backside A gap as well. Javier Suggs is like 6'3" and that's a little bit longer. So there, are we going to start looking at a Jake Anderson? Are we going to start looking at some of the guys a little bit farther down, a little bit younger guys like Akpano? It really depends, again, how they want to play that role. Charles Perkins, I thought originally Charles Perkins would be that kind of role, but I think obviously combination injury and then how the guys ahead of him kind of took over, it kind of changed what that field side three tech type player is going to be. So we want a little bit more length, a little bit more pass rush ability, and that could be coming for someone like Jake Anderson. Longer body, he's 6'5", 290 pounds, 300 pounds. He'll be over 300 pounds by the time they get into the season. So you're going to have that interior edge setter is what we're going to be looking for in that kind of spot right there. All right, so next up, the star linebacker spot. I mean, first off, obviously, because he played there last season, is going to be Thomas Heiberger is going to be your first shot at that. Obviously, you got guys, a guy like Landon Gothier could potentially be in that mix as well. But the one that I'm really looking at is John Kamara. John Kamara is an athlete. He's long, he's fast, he's strong. And when you got guys like Cooper Catalano and Mason Posa starting on the interior, you don't want them to leave the field. You got to find a way to get athletes like him on the field. And I think the star linebacker spot could be a perfect role for him because he has the athletic ability to play sideline to side or edge to sideline. He's got the length that could create matchup issues potentially in the passing game. And he's got the quickness that you can put him a little bit wider but still get him involved in the pass rush with blitzes, etc. So he'd be a name that I'd be looking for potentially filling that role going forward. All right, so next up, let's talk about the Corey Walker role, the oversized, run-down, pseudo-defensive end. And I think that's going to be Michael Gardner. Obviously, we saw that last year when Corey Walker was injured. Michael Gardner got a few reps. Again, big body, 6'5", over 300 pounds. He's got some quickness. He did a pretty good job playing against the run and the limited reps that he got last year. So I think Michael Gardner is going to slip into that role pretty quickly. All right, so let's get into the edge players, the outside linebackers of the edges, and let's talk about last year's Sebastian Cheeks. This is your field side, a guy who's going to give you a pass rush ability, but is going to win more on the field side edge with speed, and then has the athletic ability that we can drop into coverage. Now, a lot of people have Nicholas Clayton pegged as a pass rush specialist, given just his insane burst and his ability to get off the ball. I think he can be more than that. And I think if you put him in this role that Sebastian Cheeks was last year as that field side outside linebacker, you can let him be that edge guy 75% of the time. But every now and then, you drop him in coverage. You create a threat to the field side of the offensive line where that running back is going to be to manipulate protection. And then you drop him into coverage. And then you bring pressure from the backside that sets up one-on-one blocks on the backside, that sets up better chances for interior rush. And you just allow him to drop where he's going to have help and just let him be athletic. I think that's a perfect opportunity for Nicholas Clayton to get more playing time and more substantial playing time as a redshirt freshman. So next up is the Darrell Peterson role. And we want that big body cross between a kind of an inside linebacker and a defensive tackle. If we can get some pass rush out of it, that would be great. But a guy that players around him are going to benefit from. And this is the one that I'm struggling with the most because I can think about 4 guys that could get reps in this particular spot. It depends on how you use them. But I want to keep things kind of simple here. And I'm going to say it's probably going to come down to Justice Boone and Tyrese Fearbreed, but more likely a Justice Boone. Obviously, he's 280 pounds, big body. And maybe instead of having him as more of a pass rusher who has the size to hold the run, we're looking for an outside linebacker who has the size and strength to hold the run and then can use that to set an edge to help set a pass rush around him. So I think Justice Boone probably be the first guy we're going to be looking at in that spot. And that leads us to the Mason Reiger role. The easiest way to define the Mason Reiger role is all of these edge players. Who's the guy you want to have on the field at all times who doesn't need to come out? And to me, I think that's going to be Sebastian Cheeks. He's not as big as Mason Reiger. Mason Reiger had 20 pounds and 2 inches on him. But Sebastian Cheeks is strong. He's fast. I don't know if we're going to be able to move him inside as much as Mason Reiger, if he's going to be able to play a 4-eye, but give him another season in the offseason program. They'll put more weight on him. If he gets north of 245, I bet you that's what they can do with him, is play him more inside in situations, obviously. So I think of the remaining edge outside linebackers, Cheeks is the most well-rounded skill-wise. And you put him in combination with a guy like Nicholas Clayton on the other side, that is a deadly combination. So, and that's just kind of your players who are defined, the roles that are defined by the players who played them before. Obviously, we are going to have our short yardage, extra defensive tackle types, nose tackle types, and that's where you're going to start seeing, your Nolan Veals getting into that rotation, and you're going to have the bigger run edge outside linebacker type. Aaron Witt is going to be moving back into that role. Pure pass rush is going to be somebody like Liam Dannons. But already, if we just think about all the players that we just mentioned, all these individual roles, and how many different players can play those roles, to me, that sounds like we are building depth. Because we have players who can play all these different roles, and we can build scheme around it. So when offenses try to adjust their blocking scheme based on a certain player type, we can have a counter to it that can achieve the same result but with totally different player personnel groupings. At least that's the theory. All right, I think we're going to call it there. I'm really looking forward to seeing how the coaching staff deploys the, again, rebuilt defensive line group, the new outside linebacker group, and the solid, but now starting to be a little bit log-jammed inside linebacker group. Next time we talk about this, we're going to talk about the new defensive back room. Not rooms. You got your safeties, you got your corners. We brought in 6 of them. And everyone's going to have a role. And a lot of that's going to come down to what this coaching staff's philosophy on pass coverage is going to be in 2026. But we'll save that for another time. Thank you, as always, for watching, and we will see you next time.